Aya friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chaf, Daf 20 of Masechta Sukkah. Chaver, Daf Chaf is the final Daf of the first parak of Masechta Sukkah. So, what do you guys think? How was the first parak of Masechta Sukkah? Interesting experience, right? I mean, it's a combination of fun and extremely hard. So, what do you want me to tell you? So, alright, today's daf, we discuss mats, using mats, like square mats for schach. And the machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer regarding that. And honestly, and then the daf just gets like very technical. What do you want me to tell you? But there's actually a super interesting Gemara at the bottom of Chaf Amud Aleph. So let us just jump in. Lemaisa, let's just start with the Mishnah on Yud Testament Beis. I know it's a little bit high up. I just don't think that there's really a better way to go. So let's, we already did the Mishnah at the end of the day yesterday, but we'll start with that today. Yud Testament Beis, new Mishnah, Machzeles, Konim Gedola. So if you have a mat made out of reeds, and Lemaisa, it's big, okay? So if the mat was made for sleeping, well, then that makes it a kli. If it's a kli, it's makabel tumah. And if it's makabel tumah, you cannot use it for schach, of course. L'sikuch, but if the mat is for schach, well then givaldik misakrin then makabelas tumah. So then you can use it for schach, and it's not makabel tumah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer, achas ketana v'achas gedola, whether it's small, whether it's big, asal l'shchivim makabelas tumah. If you make it for sleeping, then it's a kli and it's makabel tumah ben misakrin ba, and you can't use it for schach l'sikuch. But if you use it for schach, if you made the mat for schach the misakrin ba, you can use it for schach ben makabelas tumah, and it does not receive tumah. Okay, fine. If it's for schach, then it doesn't receive tumah, and you can use it. Okay. So what's the difference between the Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer? There seems to be, it's unclear, Lemaisa. It's unclear, Lemaisa, because both of them say that if it's for sleeping, so then it's a kli and you can't use it. And they both say that if it's for schach, then it's not a kli and you can use it. The only difference seems to be about the big versus small. Anyways, we're going to have to figure this out, or at least attempt to. Says the Gemara, Agufa Kasha. The Gemara says, 1 second, this doesn't make any sense. Why not? Because Omart, on the one hand you said, Asal l'shchivim mekabeles tumah, vein misakrim ba. On the one hand, it says that if you made this mat for sleeping, well then it's mekabel tumah and you can't use it for schach. Okay? What's the implication? That by default though, meaning if you specifically made it for sleeping, so then you cannot use it for schach. By default though, it would be for schach, and you can use it. If you made it specifically for sleeping, then you can't. But by default, you can't. The reason why you're unable to use it is because you specifically, deliberately made it for sleeping. Hostama. But if you, I think I had some pizza maybe in my Gemara. I don't know, something. Probably pizza. What else would it be? So then, hostama. But by default, the sikuch, it would be for schach. But then you said the sikuch misakrin ba, that if the mats are for schach, if they're deliberately for schach, well then you can use them. Ve'enim mekabelas tumah, and it doesn't receive tumah. Time dasal l'sikuch. The reason is specifically because you made it for schach. Hastama l'shchiva. But by default, it's for sleeping. Chaver, you hear the kasha, right? You hear the kasha. On the one hand, we're saying that if you specifically made it for sleeping, you're not allowed to use it, implying that by default it's for schach and you can use it. But then we say if you specifically made it for schach, you are allowed to use it, but by default it sounds like it would be for sleeping, in which case you're not allowed to use it. So which one is it? Make up your mind, right? Make up your mind. So, answers the Gemara Holokasha. This is no problem. Kam b'gdola, kam b'ktana. It depends how big the mat is. If we're talking about a large mat, right? Meaning, what does Mishnah say? Machzeles konim gedola. If it's a large mat, asar l'shchiv mekabelas tumah. If you specifically make it for sleeping, then it's mekabel tumah. But by default, it would be for schach. And then says the Gemara that then when the Mishnah says that if you make it specifically for schach, it's kosher, but by default it would be for sleeping. So then that is talking about a small one. So a big one by default is for schach. A small one by default is for sleeping. Ema safe. Now the Gemara says, wait a second. Not going to work. Because if we go weiter in the Mishnah, what does it say? Rabbi Eliezer Omer says, Rabbi Eliezer, achas ketana v'achas gedola, whether it's a small mat, whether it's a large mat, if you made it specifically for sleeping, it's mekabel tuma ve'en mesakin, but you can't use it for schach. That's because you specifically made it for sleeping. By default, the sikuch, it would be for schach. Ema seifa, but then Rabbi Eliezer continues and says, if you specifically made it for schach, misakrin, but you can use it for schach, it doesn't receive tumah. The reason is is because you specifically made it for schach. By default, the shchiva would be for sleeping. And it wouldn't be allowed. Meaning, we wanted to explain that, okay, the Tanakama is no problem. Because when we say that by default it's for schach, it's talking about a big one. And when it says by default it's for sleeping, it's talking about a small one. But, what about when it comes to Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Eliezer says that whether we're talking about a small one, whether we're talking about a big one, it's the same thing. Which is, that if it's specifically you made it for sleeping, it's a problem, but implying that by default it's for schach. But if specifically you made it for schach, it's kosher, but by default it would be for sleeping. And over there it says, whether it's small, whether it's big. Meaning that you can't say that one's talking about when it's big and one's talking about when it's small, because it says bain when it's small, bain when it's big, and then we have contradictory defaults. So what's the deal? How do you explain? So while, sure, we could have explained the Tanakama by saying, okay, one's big and one's small, but you can't get out of this question when it comes to Rabbi Eliezer saying one's talking about when it's big and one's talking about when it's small, because he says that whether it's talking about when it's small, whether it's talking about when it's big, it's going to be the same halacha, and still there seems to be these contradictory default statuses. So how do we explain this? Elo amar Rava. So rather, Rava had gesagt, Bigdola kule alma lo plige de stama le sikuch. Okay, so rather comes Rava to explain that when it comes to a large mat, everyone agrees that by default it is not for sleeping. By default it is for schach. Okay, again, says Rava, when it comes to a large mat, everyone agrees that by default it's for schach. And if you have specific intention that it's for sleeping, so then it's for sleeping and you can't use it. But by default, it's for schach. Ki plige, friends. Where did they argue? Where's machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim? Biktana. When it comes to a small mat, Tanakama savar stam kitana l'shchiva. Tanakama holds that when it comes to a smaller mat, all of a sudden now it changes, and by default it's for sleeping on the smaller mat. And if you specifically have intention for schach, then you can use it for schach, but by default, it's for sleeping and you cannot use it. For Rabbi Eliezer Sofer, Rabbi Eliezer says no. Bain biktana, bain bigdola, it's the same halacha, which is stam kitana nami, the sikuch. That the smaller mat is also for schach, and by default, you can use it, and it's the same halacha for small and big. V'achi ka'amar, and this is how you have to understand the Mishnah. Machzelas hakonim, gedola, when it comes to a large mat of reeds, asa l'shchiva, if you deliberately make it for sleeping, well then, mikabelas tumah, it receives tumah ve'misakim, but you cannot use it for schach. Taimad asa l'shchiva. However, that's specifically because you made it for sleeping. Ha, stamo naisa kemi she'asa l'sikuch u'misakim. But by default, we assume that it's made for schach, and you can use it for schach. And that is across the board. Everyone agrees with that. Vasar Rabbi Eliezer lemeimar, and says, it comes Rabbi Eliezer to say, achas ketana ve'achas gedola, that whether it be small or whether it be large, it's going to be the same halacha, which is stama kshera l'sikuch. By default, you can use it for schach. But the Chachamim would disagree, right? So meaning, everyone agrees that when it comes to a larger mat, by default it is for schach, and you can use it. The Chachamim, however, say, but when it comes to a smaller mat, all of a sudden now by default it's for sleeping, and you cannot use it. If you made it specifically for schach, then that's a different story. But by default it's for sleeping. Comes Rabbi Eliezer to say, no, bein kach uvein kach, whether it's large, whether it's small, it's the same halacha, which is that by default it is for schach. Omer Abai. Now Abai says to Rava, what do you think he says? He has two kashas. Ihochi, Eliezer Omer achas ketana v'achas gedola v'achas ketana miboile. Ho ho. Yeah. Very technical kasha, Cheveh. Very, very technical kasha. What's the technical kasha? The technical kasha is that Rabbi Eliezer, that says Abaye, according to this logic, if we're saying that everyone agrees that by a big mat it's for schach, the Chacham say, but by a small mat it's for shlufen, and comes Rabbi Eliezer to say that they're both the same, you know what Rabbi Eliezer should say? That actually, whether it's big, like we said that it's for schach, but even whether it's also small, it's still for schach. That's not what Rabbi Eliezer says. If you look at what he says, he actually says the opposite, which is whether it's small or whether it's big. And says Abaye, look, if we're saying everyone agrees when it's big, and the question is how do you relate to when it's small, really Rabbi Eliezer should say whether it's big or whether it's small, as opposed to what he actually says, which is whether that it's small or whether it's big. What do you want me to tell you, Chav? That's the kasha. Ve'od, and more so, ki plige, begedola hu de plige. And more so says Abaye, actually, the machlokes is not, like you wanted to say, Rava, that the machlokes is by the smaller mat. Rather, the machlokes is by the larger mat. Rabbi Eliezer l'chumra, and Rabbi Eliezer is actually being more stringent. Here we go. The Tanya, as we learn in a Brayso Machzelas Sakonim, that when it comes to this mat of reeds, bigdola misakrin ba. So if it is a large mat, so then the Tanakama says you're allowed to use it. Rabbi Eliezer Omer says Rabbi Eliezer im einu mikabeles tumo misakrin ba. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer argues and says no. By default, it's for shlufen and you cannot use it. If you specifically make it for schach, then you can use it for schach. Ella, Amar Papa, rather says Papa, B'gitana kuli amalo plige distam l'shriva. So rather says Papa that when it comes to a small mat, everyone agrees that it's for shlufen, and therefore it's a kli, and you cannot use it for schach. Ki plige, where they argue is begedola, by a larger mat. Tanakama savar stam gedola l'sikuch. The Tanakama holds that by default the large mat. I hope I haven't been saying large sukkah and small sukkah. We're talking about mats here, just to clarify, right? So by default, the large mat, says the Tanakama, stam gedola l'sikuch, it's for schach. Rabbi Eliezer savar, whereas Rabbi Eliezer holds no, ma pitom, stam gedola nami l'shchiva, that by default the larger mat is also for shlufen. Umay asa l'shchiva di ka'amar. And what does it mean that he made it? It means he made it for, well, does shchiva mean sleeping, or does it mean for mean just like for sitting? Maybe even just for sitting. Whatever it is. Sitting, sleeping, anything that has to do with like putting your body weight on it, I guess. It's probably the same thing, I imagine. That's the nafkamina. The point is that it's a kli. So what does it mean that if he specifically made it, when we say that, it says Rabbi Eliezer that if he specifically made it for sitting, let's even say, that by default, when it comes to large, or when it comes to the, I guess either the large one or the small one, if he, right, because it says Rabbi Eliezer, ben kitana ben gedola, if you, what does it say? That by default it's going to be for lying over the sikuch until you specifically make it for schach. So, says Abaye, or really a Papa explaining Abaye, or based on Abaye, that according to Rabbi Eliezer, regardless of if the mat is large, regardless of if the mat is small, and by default it is for lying, and it's makabel tumah, and you cannot use it as schach. If you If you specifically make it for schach, well then it's a different story and it's usable, it's not makabel tumah. The Chachamim say that the smaller mat is for lying and it's makabel tumah, but the larger, and it's possible for schach, but the larger mat by default is for schach and it's not makabel tumah and you can use it for schach. Alright friends, ready for this? Until the end of the parak it gets kind of funny. So, if you like funny, well, then you might like this. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, machzelas shel shifa v'shel gemi, okay, if you have a machzelas made out of shifa or gemi, okay, some kind of material made out of like plants or something, misachrim ba, so you can, gedola misachrim ba, if it's large, you can use it for schach, getane misachrim ba, if it's small, you push it, can't use it for schach, shel konim v'shel chelas, if it's made out of reeds or sedge, Dennis. Gedola misakrimba, if it's large, so then you can use it for schach. Aruga, if it's woven in misakrimba, then you can't use it because then it's made for like, lying on and then you can't use it because it's like a kli. Okay. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, Omer says Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, Mishum Aviv, the name of his father, Achazov, misakrimba, whether it's woven or whether it's like braided or whatever, you can use it for schach. It doesn't really matter. V'chein ha'yu Reb Dosa Omer Kedvarv, and Reb Dosa would also say that whether this sedge or reeds are woven or whether they're braided, you can use it for schach, no problem. It's not considered a kli. It's not for sitting. You can use it for schach. So, chevra, again, my recommendation is use what everybody else uses. Tanan Hossam, we learn over there. I think it's in Edius. No, it's funny, like I was learning in this and I was getting nervous because like usually recently, like when we say like bring some Mishnah, it's probably coming from like Kalim or Ohalos, some place where like your sort of initial reaction is like you want to run away. But obviously we don't run away over here because we just go head on at Babylon Talmud. That's what we always have done, and God willing, we always will continue to do. We don't run away from anything over here. Let's go weiter. So what I was saying was that, so I saw that this Mishnah Taka comes from Adius, and I was like, oh, okay, Adius, that's not bad. Well, the thing with Adius is it can kind of be anything. So here it's basically Ohalos. What do you want me to tell you? Let's go weiter. So, Tanan Osam. So we learned in Adios, but like, for all intents and purposes, this Mishnah could be in Ohalos. But kol achotzalos mitamin tmeimes, that all the chotzalos, okay, we're going to have to explain what chotzalos are, but all the chotzalos can become tameh from a corpse, alright? Diver Reb Dosa, that's what Reb Dosa says, alright? The Chacham say midras, that these chotzalos could be tameh from like tumas midras. So if you have like a zav kind of friend guy, and he's all zavi and everything, and he sits on a chotzalos, so it'll become tameh tumas midras. Midras in tmei meis lo, frak the Gemara, wait, only tumas midras, but not tumas meis, and it can't become tameh, like become an avatuma. So viha anantanam, but we learned in a Mishnah, called matami midras, matami tmeimes, that anything that's matami midras is also matami tmeimes. So therefore, what does it mean that the Chachamim say that it's matami midras? What, not tmeimes? So ema af midras. So rather say no, even midras. So kilo, according to the Chachamim, it's matami tmeimes, of course, like Reb Dosa, but even midras. My chotzalos, what a chotzalos? Amar Avdimi bar Amaduri mazovle. So Avdimi bar Amaduri says it's marzovle. Shkoich. My marzovle. What's marzovle? Amar Ba'ada mizavle. So Baba says it's tak mizable, which is leather bags. Okay, friends, chotzalos, leather bags, according to Reb Abba. Sounds good to me. Reb Shimon ben Lakish, Omer says Reb Shimon ben Lakish machzalos mamish. So Reb Lakish says it's taka actual mats. All right, sounds geschmack. Was Rish Lakish the time made? Rish Lakish, who says that chotzalos are actual mats, he goes according to his reasoning. Now, chevra, these next lines of Gemara are gold. they're gold. Dam Rish Lakish, the Rish Lakish says, Harini kaporas Reb Chia uvanav ha. Says Rish Lakish that he is the kapara. He's the atonement for Reb Chia and his children. What does Rashi say? Yisurin abayin olai, the Yisurin that come upon me, the afflictions that come upon me, the chaparos shel Reb Chia uvanav you. They should be an atonement for Reb Chia uvanav. V'lashon kavod hu zeh k'shumazkir aviv or rabbu lachrim yisasu. It's kind of like a honorable way to, when you mention your Rebbe after he passes away, to kind of say it in this way, that anything that comes upon me should be an atonement for my Rebbe Reb Chia and his children. Anyways, super interesting. So it says, Rish Lakish, Harini kaparas Reb Chia uvanov. I should be, anything that comes upon me, any afflictions that come upon me should be a kapara for Reb Chia and his children, an atonement for Reb Chia and his children. Shebatchila, that initially kishenishtakha Torah mi Yisrael, when the Torah was forgotten from the Yidden, ole Ezra mi Bavel v'Yasda, Ezra came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and he reestablished Torah in Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi points out also at the bottom of the page, Kishenishtakha Torah Yisrael, lo nistakha kula. It doesn't mean that they mamish forgot the Torah completely. Ka'amar ela halachos shchuchos mi bnei Beseira. So that was talking about Hillel, but certain halachas got forgotten, right? Like we learned in Masechet Pesachim and Daf Nun Vav, Samach Vav, I think, and Daf Samach Vav, that like the Bnei Beseira forgot certain halachas, and Hillel Abav, right? They said certain, right? Hillel reminded them. I think it was about the Korban Pesach that's brought on Shabbos, I think. Anyways, but we said that, okay, so initially when at least certain halachas were forgotten from the Yidden, came Ezra from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and he reestablished them. Chazav v'nishtachcha, when it got forgotten another time, Hillel Bavli v'yasta, Hillel came from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael, and then he reestablished Torah in Eretz Yisrael. Chazav v'nishtachcha, and then certain halachas got forgotten again. Alu Reb Chia uvanav v'yasdua, and Reb Chia and his children came to Eretz Yisrael and established it. Gewaldig. Now, the interesting thing about Reb Chia is he was around the time of like Rebbe and stuff like that. So the Torah wasn't, it's interesting what exactly this means, because it wasn't quite forgotten. Obviously there was Rebbe and the great Tanoim at that time, but I guess maybe it helped out or something. Anyways, super, super interesting. It's just a really interesting Gemara. V'chein amar Reb Chia uvanav. And says Rish Lakish, this is what Reb Chia and his children said, Lo nechleku Reb Dosa v'chacham amachzalos shel Usha, that Reb Dosa and the Chacham agree that when it comes to the machzalos, the mats of Usha, shein tmeos, that they are tmeos. Meaning, because remember, Rish Lakish said that these chotzalos are mats. So we're seeing that Rish Lakish is saying that Reb Dosa and the Chacham agree that when it comes to mats from Usha, that they are tmeos, that they're going to be tamei, because the mats from Usha were for sitting on them, and therefore they're going to be tamei, even tumas midrash, because of course, I remember, we discussed in Masechta Shabbos, and we were discussing even in Babylon Talmud about this, I think, about amod v'naisim lachtenu. When it comes to tumas midrash, it has to be something that's miyuchad liyeshiva, something that specifically you sit on, not something that, that like, let's say you take a pail and flip it over, and then the people working there are going to say, hey, don't sit on that, I need it. So that's not something that'll be mitami tumas midrash. But if it's specifically for sitting, so mitami tumas midrash. So everyone agrees that when it comes to the mats of Usha, I have a friend, Nadav Sorling, he lives on Usha Street. Oh, am I not supposed to say that? Oh, forget it. That's not really his name, and he doesn't really live on Usha Street. But there's a street in Nachlod called Usha. Also it's Taka right next to Tveria Street and Tzipori Street. That's where the Mayanot Shul is. I know that Jordan very much enjoys going to the Mayanot Shul, as she mentioned on the Siyum from Masechta Yoma. Let's go weiter. So Shein Tmeos, Vishal Tveria, Shein Teoros, and that the reeds that these mats of Tveria are Taka Tehoris, because they're not for sitting. Alright, what do you want me to tell you? Meaning they don't get tumas midrash. So where do Reb Dosa and the Chacham argue that Reb Dosa says that's davka mitame tumas meis, but not mitame midrash, and the Chacham say even midrash? So amanechliku al shar mekomis, on the mats of other places. My savar came the leka diyosav alayu k'detveria damyan. Reb Dosa says that since most people don't sit on these other mats, so then it's like the Tveria ones that are not makabel tumas midras umar savar came into mikre v'yosve alayu kidu usha damyon, and the chacham hold well since people sometimes sit on these mats, so then they are like the mats of usha that are for sitting, and therefore they are makabel tumas midras. Very, very beautiful stuff. So what do we see? So we see that Rish Lakish holds that these chotzalos are mats. Gewaltig. Let's go weiter, Chevre. Now remember, what did we just say? We just said that these mats, Reb Dosa says that they're makabel tuma, right? Tuma sameis. Reb Dosa says they're makabel tuma sameis, which means that they're obviously a kli. And if they're a kli, then you can't be using these mats for schach, right? Now, Reb Dosa had also said that when it comes to these mats of reeds or of sedge, so Reb Dosa said, just like, who is it? Reb Shimon Gamliel, I think, that, like Reb Yismael, Reb Yossi, that whether they're braided or whether they're woven, you're allowed to use them for schach, which means that they are not a kli and they would not be makabel tuma. So that's going to be the kasha, right? So meaning, Omer Mar, we just said, kol achotzalos metamen tmeimes, divi Reb Dosa. The Reb Dosa says that all of the chotzalos, all of these mats, are metame tmeimes, which means that they are a kli. Well, or meaning if they're obviously then, well, yeah, they're a kli, and obviously they're makabel tuma, which means that they would be possible for schach. Ve'atane, but yet we learn in the brayso v'chein Reb Dosa omer kedvarav. The Reb Dosa says, like Rabbi Shmuel Reb Yossi, that you can use these mats for a schach. Lo kasha, it's no problem. Hod the isle gadanfa, hod the leisle gadanfa. So it depends if they have like a rim or not. If they have a rim, so that makes it a kli, and it'll be makabel tuma. If it doesn't have a rim, so then it's not a kli, and you can use it for schach. Meisvei, we have a kasha. Chotzalos shel sham v'shel gemi. These chotzalos of sham or of gemi, v'shel sak v'shel sfira, or of goat hair or of horse hair, mitame tmeimes divi Reb Dosa. Reb Dosa says that they can become tamei tumas hames. All right. The chacham say af midras, even tumas midras. V'shalom l'man da'amar marzovle. So I understand, according to the Man Da'amar, who says that we're talking here about bags. Well, shal sham v'shal gemi chazu lechinta defere. So I get it. These chotzalos of sham and shal gemi that are like for bags or whatever. So they can be for baling of larger produce. Okay. Shal sak. I think it's what I wrote. Why not? Shal sak v'shal sfira, and the chotzalos of goat hair and of horse hair. So then chazul gulke v'tzane, they could be used for long pouches and sacks. All right. Mamish, but if you say it's mamish talking about mats, b'shlomo shal sak v'shal sfira, I understand if they're made out of goat hair or of horse hair, chazul lefarsev and afvasa, you can use them for curtains and for sieves. But what are the mats of sham and gemi fit for? So chazu linazyasa, they're fit for covering brewing vats. Those who say I understand if you say that these chotzalos are mamish mats. Well, sham v'shal gemi chazu linazyasa, the mats made out of sham and gemi are fit for covering brewing vats. Shalsak v'shal svir chazu l'farsif v'navasa, and the ones made out of goat hair and horse hair you can use for curtains and sieves. But if you say it's bags, b'shlomo shalsak v'shal svira, I understand if they're made out of goat hair and horse hair, they're good for baling of larger produce and log pouches. But but oh no, did I skip some? I don't know. I probably got mixed up with all these random stuff. Wait, Golke Vitsani. Oh, Golke Vitsani was long pouches and sacks. All right. El shel sham v'shel gemi l'maychazu. What are the ones of goat hair and horse hair good for? Chazu l'kinta defere. They're good for the baling of larger produce. All right, sounds very nice. Tani, we learned in the Brayso. Amar Reb Chananya, says Reb Chananya, K'sherati legola, when I went to Bavel, matzasi zaken echad va'amerli. I found a certain elder, and he lemaisa said to me, Mesakim bebudya, you can use mats for schach. Shabasa etza Rabbi Yoshua achi Abba, and when it came to my uncle Rabbi Yoshua Hoda Lidvarv, he said, "Yep, that's correct." Amar Rav Chizda, says Rav Chizda, "V'udeleis legadanfa." That's as long as these mats don't have a rim. Amar Ula, says Ula hani budyasa divnei mechoza. These mats of mechoza ilmale kir shaloyin. If not for their rim, mesachim bu, you would be able to use them for schach. Tanan amiyach. We also tackle in a brayso like this. Mesachim bebudya. You can use mats v'im yesh lein kir mesachim boin. If they have some kind of rim, then you cannot use them for schach. Hadron alach sukkah. We'll come back to sukkah. Lemaise, we probably will come back to sukkah because sukkah. The first parak of sukkah was hard stuff. Let's be honest, hard stuff. But I don't know. Sukkah is still kind of fun. Also, there's like important halachas there in terms of constructing a sukkah. But Chevra, what did you think about the first parak of Masechta Sukkah? Of course, as always, let us know in WhatsApp, and we could share our experience starting. Chevra, oh right, let us review. So today we started off the daf discussing mats, right? These large mats, small mats. This machlokas between Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer. Two ways of understanding this machlokas. We have Rava's way of understanding it and Abayi's on the way of understanding it. So Rava says, look, when it comes to large mats, everybody agrees. If you have a large mat, so by default it's going to be for schach. If you want to specifically make it for sleeping, so then it'll be a kli and you cannot use it for schach. But by default, everyone agrees that it's for schach. Now, when it comes to smaller mats, so then the Tanakama says that by default it's going to be for sleeping, and therefore it's makabel tum and you cannot use it for schach. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says no, benka, right? Whether it's small, whether it's big, it's the same halacha, which is that it is for schach, and you can use it. It says Abaye, actually it's the opposite, that the machlokas is dafka by the large schach. Or let's start with the other way around. Everyone agrees that when it comes to the smaller mat, it's going to be for sleeping and you cannot use it. When it comes to a larger mat, the chachamim say that it's for schach and you can use it, and Rabbi Eliezer says no, it's also for sleeping and you cannot use it. And then we just got into like some really technical stuff about all sorts of things towards the end. But that was really, I'd say, the main sugya of the daf. What was super interesting is that thing about the Torah getting forgotten, and then Ezra brought it back, and then it got forgotten again, and Hillel brought it back, and it got forgotten again, and Reb Chia and his children brought it back. That was a very interesting Gemara. Very, very interesting. Chevra, that was Daf Chof. That was also the first parak of Masechta Sukkah. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.